Every summer, nitrogen and phosphorus runoff in the Gulf of Mexico causes algae blooms across miles of the Gulf. These blooms cut off oxygen and give rise to a dreaded phenomena known as dead zones. On today's program, we're speaking with three experts all about the Gulf dead zones, what causes them, what is being done about them, and how it impacts local communities from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to the northern farms that are responsible for much of this runoff. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in and associate director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and the associate director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. First up today, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Eric Geidel and Dr. David Schwertney, two researchers at the University of Iowa who are attached to the Blue Gap Project. That's an NSF-funded grant project working directly around the issue of nitrogen runoff all along the Mississippi River Valley area and into the Gulf. Dr. Eric Geidel, Dr. David Schwertney, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Just to start us off, can you introduce yourselves a little and tell us a little bit about your work and specifically what Blue Gap is?
Sure, Eric, I'll go first here. My name is Dave Schwertney. I'm a professor of civil environmental engineering and chemistry up at the University of Iowa. My broad expertise is on issues related to water quality, particularly at these intersections of public health. And so what Blue Gap ends up being about is this issue of nitrogen pollution. It's this sort of undiscussed or underappreciated massive environmental challenge we have. And I always think it's pretty unique because you might be wondering why folks up here at Iowa work with folks down along the Gulf of Mexico, but it's the pollution that links us, the nitrogen pollution up here that makes its way down to the Gulf and then impacts communities far away. And so what we've been trying to do with Blue Gap is just elevate that by using an approach that sort of brings not just science and data to the discussion, but also storytelling and different forms of art and media, realizing there might be a lot of ways to get folks to engage with this issue. So we're going to sort of elevate discourse and then also help people feel like they have some empowerment to do something about it. And so that's what got me to work with Eric here, and I'll let him introduce himself, but it's not so often you find a collaboration of an engineer and an English professor, but it's been one of the real joys for me to work with him as we come at this problem from two sides.
Yeah, and my name is Eric Geidel. I'm a professor of English literature here at the University of Iowa. I've been teaching here for over 25 years. My area of scholarship concerns the intersection between environmental history and literary history, and I've become much more involved over recent years with working with our program in sustainability up here, and very interested in trying to bring the humanities into dialogue with STEM fields and engineering around environmental issues. I've been particularly interested in this on the graduate level and how we can kind of work with different graduate students to broaden their perspective on the kind of skills that they have as graduate students in the humanities and how they might apply it. So when Dave approached me about the Blue Gap initiative, I was very, very interested. It's been a wonderful opportunity. I've been given funding to work with consecutive teams of graduate students in the arts and in the humanities, producing creative content for the platform that they're trying to build. And this has involved deep collaboration with the Institute for Hydraulic Research up here and the kind of pretty extensive network of community connections that they have, a lot of different community partners. So that on the one hand, this is very much a cross-disciplinary effort between Dave and I, between environmental engineering, civil engineering, and English, but it's also been a collaboration with many, many community partners, people working throughout the state, from farmers to watershed managers to community organizations, and trying to find ways that the skills and perspectives that students and scholars in the arts and in the humanities can bring to help narrate the nature of this problem.
That's really exciting. And we're going to ask you a lot more about that kind of collaborative process and some of the more finer details on Blue Gap in a minute. But I know Jessica has some starter questions on actually what it is you're looking at first. So I'll let Jessica jump in.
Yeah, so you mentioned nitrogen as this sort of under appreciated and understudied almost pollutant that is very prevalent and often results from practices in agriculture. So we wanted to ask, what are the primary pollutants found in agricultural runoff and how do they affect water quality?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. One of our real challenges up here in Iowa, and this is why we wanted to focus on this, is actually nitrogen, particularly the form of nitrate that we both regulate in our drinking water because it poses a safety risk in terms of it interferes with the way oxygen can transport in the blood for infants. And we have a lot of communities that have high nitrate levels in their drinking water. And so there's this very acute local challenge that we have with it. But the other thing about nitrogen that makes it kind of unique is that it is a nutrient. You hear the word nutrient and it has sort of a beneficial sort of tone to it. But this nitrogen that runs off the land in Iowa, we apply it as fertilizer. We use manure that our animal livestock produce, and then we land apply that, thinking we're using waste as a resource. But a lot of that nitrogen runs off, makes its way into the Mississippi River down to the Gulf of Mexico, and there it can lead to things like algal blooms. And you read about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, where this big, like intense mass of biological activity, eventually they die off. It leads to decomposition and oxygen being consumed. We're having impacts on ecosystems thousands of miles away that are at this continental scale. And so, this ag is not the only source of nitrogen. It can come from wastewater discharges, municipal wastewater treatment. It can come from automobiles and fossil fuel combustion in terms of different types of nitrogen containing gases. But the real challenge for us is just trying to figure out how to make this agricultural system in Iowa that is really intense in terms of corn and soybean be a little less leaky so that nitrogen isn't leaving the land and getting into people's drinking water, getting into ecosystems, and causing all the challenges that it does. There's other things that come off of ag. Lots that we need to do better monitoring. But for now, a lot of the discourse in Iowa, and probably rightly so, is focused on nitrogen because, again, it's not just affecting us here up the watershed, but folks all the way down the watershed along the Gulf. And, that makes it a priority even for folks like the US EPA and others that have put like federal resources to trying to tackle this problem.
Absolutely. And Dr. Goodall, you mentioned the importance of bringing in this community collaboration in your work with Blue Gap and in developing the solutions or at least bringing awareness to the issue. What other impacts does agricultural fertilizing have on local communities in affected areas?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, one of the issues besides the health issues that Dave mentioned is simply a question of our relationship to water, the impacts on recreation. The number of closed beaches and closed lakes every year in Iowa seems to go up. And when communities don't have, most of the communities throughout Iowa are located very close to different riverways or lakes created through reservoirs. There's a central kind of recreation opportunity, not only for swimming, but for boating and for fishing. The excessive, nitrogen pollution in those waterways can create all sorts of difficult issues. Beyond that, there's just simply the question of a kind of community's relationship to the watershed itself. I don't want to get into the weeds here, but there's a lot of ways in which communities that become aware of themselves as part of a watershed, it helps to build a lot of bridges, I would say, between different communities, between different small municipalities, small towns up and down the watershed. And so when people are kind of alienated from their waterways because the water is unpleasant or even unsafe to even go into or unpleasant to smell, it can create a kind of social fragmentation. And one of the things I've seen a lot of community organizations that we've had the privilege to work with, a lot of what they're trying to do is, in fact, bring about a higher level of kind of watershed awareness. Very much part of that is building a kind of larger sense of community and community engagement.
Great, thank you. And in terms of the future in the following decade, I want to ask you both, what challenges do you foresee in terms of water resource management and agricultural runoff, and how can they be addressed in terms of the way that expenditures on agriculture and meat consumption is still consistent, still something that we as Americans depend a lot on for things in our daily lives. So, yeah.
Eric, I'm happy to take it first, but I don't always want to speak first.
No, no, I think go ahead.
I mean, I think it all begins and ends when we think about the future with climate change. I mean, I always talk about our water quality challenges in Iowa as being like climate change is what I would consider a compounding stressor on our pollution. That, as we get periods of drought, water dries up, pollutants like nitrogen concentrate in those waterways. So things that might have been safe become less safe as they get more concentrated. We tend to have in Iowa long periods of drought and dry periods that can get followed by really intense rainfall. That tends to more quickly wash off the pollutants that accumulate on land. And so we get these real dramatic swings in our surface waters. And then there's also just challenges with people's wells who might be compromised already in terms of water quality from whether it's fertilizer or pesticides. If they're shallow and they start to dry up in climate, it sort of creates this amplifying challenge of where do we find safe, reliable drinking water, as well as just surface waters that we can recreate in, where we can cool off when it's hot. Like Eric mentioned, the beach closures. A beach in Iowa is anything where we have like a lake shore with some sand, right? If people not in Iowa laugh at us when we talk about our beaches, but when those close off, it becomes a bit of a justice issue in terms of pollution leading to algal blooms that make it unsafe to recreate. Well, free access to waterways where you could cool off and heat, that's no longer available. So, the challenge is climate, and I think we can only really start to address that if we start to show that we can better manage our resources today. Like we just have to figure out a way to have less inputs into the waterways. If that means having to control how much nitrogen we put down, how much pesticide we put down, we need to start having those conversations now, because it'll get much harder to keep sustainable water resources as the climate changes around us.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, the other thing that I've become intensely aware of over the 2 years I've been working with Blue Gap is the relationship to social and economic inequities as well. Those are also compounding factors. You have increasing concentration of land ownership in the state and depopulation of many of the rural towns. And that goes along with the very kind of negative experiences of different waterways that Dave was just mentioning. And it further kind of compounds the problem, because as you have increasing concentration of land in a few owners, as well as its exclusive use towards commodity crop production, that only exacerbates the problem as well. So it's a wicked problem. And there's clearly issues of questions of climate, questions of economics, questions of society and social structures, and then the water. And that water quality issue becomes, you start to realize, both symptomatic of those larger problems, but also itself then a driving force.
Well, that's kind of a perfect place, I think, to turn back a little bit to Blue Gap itself, because you're bringing up how it's a wicked problem. You're bringing up all these different kind of ramifications and impacts it has across. These aren't like bordered by disciplinary lines, and you've created this interdisciplinary project. So I would love to hear more about, how is it that you've brought together this team from, all these different groups? Dr. Geidel, you're in English. I know that one of the things you're really thinking about is storytelling as part of the solution process. So I'd really love to hear about how this came to be, and then, yeah, what that kind of collaborative space looks like.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll take the lead on this this time. Yeah, I mean, Dave brought me in because they were already working up here in Iowa on hydroinformatics and building a kind of whole data structure to provide real-time information about water quality. And part of the notion was there that you needed to give communities, different organizations, different advocates, good information, good data that they could use, not only to understand their situation, but then to advocate for change. But data itself, they realized, was insufficient. And so I was very excited to try to think about other ways of conveying these kinds of issues. And I was blessed both with a lot of creative freedom that the Blue Gap team gave me, but also a wonderful group of graduate students I was able to gather over consecutive summers. And some of the graduate students came from programs in the arts. I had students from choreography, ceramics, creative nonfiction writing. Others came from more humanistic disciplines, literary studies, French and Francophone studies, history, music. And together, these students and I both learned a lot about the problem, as I say, kind of learning from Dave and other specialists at the university, but just as much from different engineers and civic leaders and community organizations, and then tried to think about how do you bring together the different facets of this story. I mean, the nature of a wicked problem is that there's so many different factors involved. And these large-scale complex systems can be very difficult to comprehend. And sometimes different approaches, either through the visual arts or the narrative arts, can help make those connections a little bit more tangible, like make them a little bit more real, as well as speaking to people's emotional and aesthetic appreciation of the situation, in addition to, not instead of, but in addition to some of the technical issues. So it does seem when you're dealing with wicked problems, be they climate change or nitrogen pollution, um, the role of storytelling can be actually quite powerful. Again, as I say, in helping people to comprehend and even just apprehend the ways in which these different issues come together. That would be a start. I could go on, but maybe Dave would want to jump in here.
Well, and I'll take it from a slightly different direction in that, we're actually funded by this work. I should start by acknowledging the funders, which is the U.S. National Science Foundation, and a program that they've created, which is called the Convergence Accelerator. And I'll talk a little bit more about why it has that name. But it's a grant that's allowed us to bring this diverse team together in the name of this idea of convergence. And convergence is this sort of new buzzy type of term and thinking about research where you're sort of intentionally not just bringing different disciplines together, but transcending academic disciplines, bringing in community partners. And really, these types of exercises in convergence research are intended to tackle wicked problems. No one discipline alone can solve these really challenging issues that at the interface of systems and people and the environment. And so that was a huge part for us, right? Is bringing a diverse team together because we had the creative space through this grant to do this. And so the other people I want to acknowledge are our collaborators in Florida. At the University of South Florida, Maya Trotz is the lead investigator on the grant, and I'm her co-lead up here. We have partners in Black and Marine Science, which is a nonprofit, the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, which is one of our handful of estuary programs we have in the United States. But where I'm trying to go with this is you need this diverse a team because this problem looks different just depending on where you are, who you are, your perspectives. And so it's giving us that creative space to bring these folks together and then trying to fill this void on this issue of nutrient pollution and nitrogen pollution specifically, that when you start to talk to people about it, you find either they don't know what it is, and those that do know what it is almost feel overwhelmed by the scope and scale of it, not all that different from how folks might feel about climate change. So there's a real opportunity here to sort of take folks that aren't aware and raise awareness, and then to take the folks that have some inkling of what the matter is and actually make them feel more empowered to do something about it. And I would argue that I think as an engineer, I can't do that by myself. And I found the power of stories and the power of art and other media that Eric's groups have brought, his students have brought, just a very effective way to make sure we're broadening the umbrella, making it a very big tent of folks that feel like they can see the connections to this issue and want to be part of trying to raise awareness and drive some change. So that's a bit of the background there, but it did take a pretty unique funding opportunity to do this. And it was part of NSF's mandate from Congress to do more to tackle societally relevant problems and get it into communities, get it on the ground as soon as we can. And that's where the accelerator piece comes in.
You both talked about the importance of these storytelling projects and some of these arts projects that have emerged. I'd love to hear if there are any examples you can point us to of really specific and successful ones you thought that you were proud of, or that grew out of the program that you'd like to share as exemplars of some of the work you've been doing.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to brag about some of my students, the work that they did.
Always a good thing.
Yeah, we just came off the second group, and so there are a few from this summer and a few from last summer that I would point to, and you'll have to cut me off at a certain point. One of the students this summer is a student, he's a graduate student in history with a strong background in music. And he almost from the week one of the program this last summer, he began using sound recordings of every place we went, not only to capture the voices of the different community members we were talking about, but also many of the ambient sounds of the places we were at, the different sounds of streams and lakes. We had a huge cicada emergence up here this year, and he caught some of that as well. And he put them all together in what he called a tone poem, which is just a kind of musical collage, and added a lot of his own musical composition. And then at my urging, but also the urging of a number of his teammates, incorporated video into it as well. And the result is a 15-minute long kind of history of the transformation of the tall grass prairie up here into row crop agriculture, but also then looking at a lot of places and a lot of different communities here in Iowa where new things, new kinds of community, new kinds of agriculture are being experimented with. So it's both a kind of critique of a system, but also very much inspiring a fair amount of hope. And it's a very compelling piece. And again, he used illustrations and images supplied to him from a lot of the other students. One of the other students I was privileged to work with this summer is a PhD student in geography, and she created a story map that really underscored one of the key themes that Blue Gap is trying to get at, which is the spatial correlations between nitrate pollution and social inequity.
Mm.
Looked at disparities in income and where different other marginalized groups are concentrated in Iowa population, and found and was able to kind of visually demonstrate as well a lot of the correlations with where the particular concentrations of nitrogen pollution are. And both of these students, the geography student and the history and music student, fed into each other's programs in interesting ways, so that the story map included a lot of the soundscapes that the first student had produced, and that sound tone poem video he produced used a lot of the cartographical innovations that the other student had produced. I could give you about 10 other examples, but those two stand out to me as really nice connections between a kind of somewhat more quantitative approach to data visualization that the cartography and geography student, and a somewhat more qualitative approach to information. And both of them definitely fed on each other and produced two pieces that will get displayed or incorporated into the Blue Gap platform that I think really help bring the data and the stories together in ways that viewers, I think, will find very compelling.
No, I mean, those kind of projects are, yeah, they're so rewarding and immensely useful. And kudos to your students for coming up with those. And I know how much work, having led students on similar kinds of initiatives, how much work goes into those. And to that point, I'm really just curious to hear from the two of you. Transdisciplinary work is really demanding. It requires skill sets that, most of us aren't taught in grad school. We have to kind of learn or invent in ways. And so I would love to just learn a little bit about some of the things you've learned working on this project, and thinking about what that collaborative process does require and look like, bringing together these disciplines, working with community groups on the ground. What have been some of the lessons that you've learned over the process?
Yeah, that's a great one. I'll start. I mean, for me, one, working with Eric has been wonderful because we've been able to have the time to sort of figure out this collaboration together. But I mean, one thing that comes is just patience and time. Like, you need this type of research is not fast. This type of work is not fast. It needs to sort of be sort of incubated. And so that patience piece, communication. Like, I think we still struggle with this sometimes as a team. It's a pretty big team with folks in Florida. We have some partners in the Virgin Islands. Just, we sometimes speak past each other. So finding not even just the simple misunderstandings of I call something one thing and you call it another, but just the way we approach and try to think about like a particular problem and how we describe it. But then at the end of the day, it's trust. Like, I trust Eric with, and I'm sorry, I'm probably taking all the things you might say, Eric, but like, I trust you, like, you know, knowing that you can work with good people, you see their enthusiasm and sort of honesty and how they buy into the project, and just give them space to create. And that sometimes is hard in like an academic world, because people like to be kind of territorial and ownership over, like, this is something I want to try to control because I feel like it has this outcome for this thing that this project we're working on. But I think you have to have a deep level of trust that these folks that come from different perspectives at the core understand what you're working on, and yet let them kind of do their thing. And Eric's done a tremendous job with that, and the students, just creating beautiful pieces that resonate with so many folks. And so, like, the proof is in the pudding. Like, when you see the fact that, like, he's reaching people I can't reach, but then there's an opportunity there for us to sort of bring them to that same point together with his expertise in mind. That's what makes this really been like fulfilling and fun work.
Yeah, I would echo everything Dave said and extend it to, it was that trust is also an enormous privilege. And it was a privilege then for me to be able to extend that trust to the students I worked with. I mean, from a teaching perspective, it was fantastic because I got to choose my own students. I had many, many students apply to be part of these teams and was able to really select teams both in the summer of 23 and the summer of 24 that's just finished that were just wonderful. And I was able to, extend that trust to them and really allow them to kind of lean into what was most powerful and creative for them. I'd say the other thing that's been just wonderful is, Dave talks about, the both the strengths and the limits of any kind of discipline. From engineering perspective, they can quantify and they can articulate what the problems are, and then there's questions of communication. But at the same time, I've come to a very similar realization about the humanities, that they're both essential and insufficient, particularly when we're talking about social or environmental problems. And so it's been a real joy to be able to kind of partner with Dave and the other kind of civil and environmental engineers, both up here in Iowa as well as the people down in Florida. First of all, to learn from them, immense amount of knowledge, immense amounts of insight into the kind of nature of this problem and its history. And then also enormously gratifying to perceive the value of the work that I do when brought into dialogue with what one would initially think of as radically different disciplines. I think too often in both in engineering, I'm sure, and I certainly know in the humanities and in literary studies, we're very, very siloed and we understand our value. We speak a kind of common language, but actually that buffers us from really understanding what's important about what we're doing, which really can only come out not only in cross-disciplinary exchanges, but also in exchanges with community members. The work we've done, the visits with farmers, the visit with environmental engineers, watershed managers, community activists. It's been remarkably gratifying and a privilege to not only myself be able to engage in dialogue, but then to shepherd students in journalism, students in ceramics, students in choreography, students in nonfiction writing, students in English literary studies into dialogue with these people and have everyone at the table, you can almost see the light bulbs going off, understand, what's more powerful about working together. So.
That's terrific. This is been a joy just talking to this project. I know, Jessica, you have something you want to jump in with.
Yeah, so your work is absolutely cross-discipline, and it seems to really touch on both the data analytic, sort of quote unquote hard science aspects of understanding nitrogen and agricultural pollution, but also in portraying the experience in history and literature and experiences of those affected by agricultural runoff, as well as agricultural practices and the communities that depend on those for their livelihoods. So I wanted to ask, in your work and in some of these explorations that you've been doing, what are some solutions or alternative ways that are particularly notable to you in how we can amend our agricultural practices and how we can grow food to hopefully reduce the source of pollution?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I should explain. So there's aspects to the project, but we do have a sort of an online virtual platform where we do make real-time nitrogen data available. We have a lot of that in Iowa. Other places we don't, but we think there's power in even seeing where there's deficiencies in monitoring. But with that, we also have these stories. We have select community leaders. We call them our sort of alliance members and champions that we have sat down and collected their stories. And so you can see them on video. You can actually interact with data in their area. And then we do have, through our partnerships with places like the Estuary Program in Tampa Bay, suggestions for people, like an action platform. So it's the blue-green action platform, blue being water, green being land, and giving people that empowering action. So a chance for folks to actually think about solutions. And so I guess what I would say is a big takeaway from a lot of the things that Eric's students in the first summer did was just sort of getting people. There were a few interviews that were done to getting more and more folks to think about, like one quote that came out of an interview a student Muna did was the person he was speaking to asked him, "What's your relationship to water?" And I think just even getting people to stop and ask themselves that. There's so much about our relationship with water we take for granted. And I think as a result, it's why it can get marginalized in quality and in quantity, and we can exploit it as much as we do. So I think that's a powerful aspect of what we're doing. I do think there are good recommendations on the site from a farmer who's trying to implement best practice is. But also what makes Seth, our farmer in Southwest Iowa, fairly unique is he's willing to talk about how we probably need to change the way we currently do things, which puts a priority on, every last acre being cropped and trying to make profit, but actually growing food for nutrition. So Seth is very passionate about getting good nutrition built into the farm bill and have it not just be about commodities. Um, all the way down to thinking about folks in their communities that can help fill those data gaps. So we know there are places where we don't look and have data, but there's really powerful opportunities for people in communities to collect data themselves. We can connect folks to programs where they can do some of that, whether it's citizen science or participatory science, however you'd like to think of it, getting folks to actually get out, helping them understand how to develop a sampling plan, where to make those measurements, how to take those measurements through time and think about what it means. And I think all of those three things together, all those things together, help people feel we need more people to come to this issue, learn about it, and want to stay engaged with it. And we all have a role in that. And I think that's the diversity of voice and experience we're trying to bring, and then back it up with evidence. So when people say well, that's just one person's opinion on things, well, no, here, explore deeper, let us show you where there's these opportunities and where there are these challenges. So those are some things that come to mind for me is just, there's things that all of us in our daily lives can do, from helping fill data gaps to changing the way we use our land and our relationship to the land and water to be more impactful. Eric, thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, well, you covered a lot, but I would first underscore one of the points you made about the work a lot of the students did had to do with their relationship to water, right? What are individual people's relationship to water? That's something that got portrayed in a lot of the different projects that my students produced over both summers in a manifold of different media. But then, the intention of this platform is also, as Dave just said, for people to make connections between their own experiences, their own relations, and other people's experiences and relations across different watersheds or up and down different watersheds. And so the information platform that they're building is really remarkable because you can scale in and you can scale out and you can see how data in one part of a watershed relates to data in another part of a watershed. And analogously, the kind of more personal and qualitative representations of different people's experiences of water. On the one hand, we're just focusing on these individuals, and as Dave said, these kind of water quality champions that get prioritized, or my students as well featured quite a number of others. But then the goal is to connect those, to see them all connected together. And so that to understand the experience of a farmer, say, in Western Iowa, and how that relates to the experience of urban dweller in Eastern Iowa, and then ultimately to people up and down the Mississippi watershed all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So that what seem like isolated, individual, very subjective experiences of water become part of a larger pattern. And I think that's where the kind of data platform that Dave and his team have been producing, and the kind of artworks and scholarship that my students have been producing really go hand in hand. And you can really see them both trying to attend to that kind of multi-scalar and interconnected and, dare I say, intersectional way of thinking about these kind of problems.
Well, and one thing we emphasize throughout the project, and this is one of those beautiful things I think about having a diverse and transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary team, is data stories are a form of data. Like, we can use the word data and throw it around and everyone thinks of a number and looks for a trend. But in places where we don't have that information, what's more powerful probably than anything is people's experiences that they can share with you. And so we do see stories as a valuable piece of evidence that if we can get people's experiences and these be trusted folks that folks in their community want to listen to, that helps us fill some of the traditional data gaps or the numeric data gaps that, there are going to be places that are resource constrained enough that aren't going to be able to deploy some sort of fancy monitor to understand water quality challenges. But people with their experiences, their eyes, their ears, their nose, there's a lot of else that we can bring to the table of how patterns and how they use the water have changed through time. And that's, they're bringing value to that and elevating that, because that's sometimes more impactful because it immediately ties back to people's everyday lives. Like, oh yes, we used to be able to do this, now we can't. Why is it that way? And that's the sort of real, true, sort of personal experience we want people to link back to this problem, because we're not really going to make headway on the problem until more people understand how it affects them. And this is like a multi-billion-dollar problem in the United States. I mean, the EPA has that estimate. There's estimates that are larger, that when you tally up our lost quality of life from lack of recreation to public health concerns to the economy that's impacted when ecosystems collapse due to things like dead zones and fish kills. Like, this is something that we really need to figure out how to address because it does touch each of us. We just tend to gloss past it.
Well, it's been really exciting learning more about this project and all the work you're doing. I would encourage listeners who want to learn more about this to go visit blue-gap.org, which is your website. And just thank you so much for your time and coming and joining us today.
Thanks for having us. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us and your interest.
Now we'll go over to our researcher, Jessica, who has a follow-up piece on this that dives into some of the science behind the causes and the possible solutions around dead zones.
Dead zones are areas in the ocean where oxygen levels are so low that marine life cannot survive. They're known as hypoxic zones. But how could these vast stretches of water become nearly lifeless? How do organisms like phytoplankton play a part in this phenomenon, which affects the Gulf of Mexico and locations globally every year? Joining me today is Dr. Sven Kranz, an associate professor here at Rice University in Houston, to talk about his work with phytoplankton ecology and biochemistry, and how it informs our understanding of dead zones, as well as global climate change. Today we have Dr. Sven Kranz. Could you introduce yourselves to our audience and tell us a little bit about your areas of interest and research in your field?
Cool. Yeah. Thank you for having me on. Yeah, my name is Sven Kranz. I'm an associate professor in the bioscience department here at Rice. I'm associated with the ecology and evolutionary biology track, and I have a work group here consisting currently of 2 graduate students, and usually I have 3, 4 undergraduate students working in my lab. And my working group is called, which is a mouthful, Phytoplankton Ecophysiology and Biogeochemistry. If I translate that into normal words, essentially we are studying how phytoplankton, which are microscopic single-celled marine organisms, respond to environmental stimuli as well as stressors. So in that way, we investigate metabolic as well as physiological processes, essentially processes within these cells, how they take up nutrients, how they utilize light under essentially a range of environmental conditions. And we also characterize their ecological role within what we call the lower food web. So essentially the organisms which eat those phytoplankton, we look at how changes in phytoplankton affect then the next generation of, or the next trophic level, the higher organisms essentially in that way. And I also try to quantify the role of phytoplankton within global cycles in the global carbon cycle, the global nitrogen cycle. This is where the biogeochemistry comes in within that name of my group. We work both in the lab as well as in the field. So we have a large lab where we culture phytoplankton, different groups of phytoplankton under very specific controlled conditions. We can mimic different climate change scenarios. We can mimic certain changes in temperature, in light availability, and so on, and really go into the details of how the organisms respond. And we also do a lot of field work all around the world to study essentially these organisms in their natural environment.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great description of just the vast scope of the projects that your team is working on. And I think it really helps us dive into the importance of phytoplankton within the world as a species and as a group of organisms, and also how they're responding to the changing climate, different weather conditions, which is things that we talk a lot about on this show in particular. So we can dive a little bit into how phytoplankton actually act, how they behave, and how they serve their important role in this ecosystem that they live in. So one interesting tidbit, at least, and something that I remember from even learning in high school, is that phytoplankton can capture massive quantities of carbon and carbon dioxide, and this is akin to that of land plants and other producers on land. So in the ocean and on land, this sort of balancing act that's helping to remove carbon from our atmosphere. And this gives us a clue to their vital impact and importance in the biological world. So what exactly are phytoplankton, and what role do they typically play in their aquatic ecosystems?
That's a great question. Phytoplankton, they are microbes. They are usually single-celled organisms. They can be prokaryotic, meaning bacteria, or eukaryotic, essentially cells with a true nucleus and organelles within. And what they are capable of doing is they essentially conduct photosynthesis. We learned that, I think, in third grade. My son, who is now in fifth grade, learned that in third grade. So I assume every student learns that very early on, the importance of photosynthesis in the world. And you are absolutely right. Phytoplankton is similar important than all the land plants together. Essentially, half of the productivity is either from trees or grasses or biological crusts, and the other half is from all the organisms in the ocean, mainly the phytoplankton. So what they do is they utilize light energy. So they usually occur in the upper region of the ocean when sunlight penetrates the ocean until sunlight is gone. That's where they live. And then they utilize that light to produce energy, capture the inorganic carbon or the CO2, build that into biomass. And this is actually the first biomass available to other organisms. So in that way, they are the primary producers of the ocean. They are the base of the food web. And without those organisms, there would be no life essentially in the ocean. They also, over essentially the time the Earth exists, and since water was on Earth, these are the organisms who produce the oxygen. That's these organisms really gave rise to all the other organisms with the oxygen now coming into the atmosphere. So phytoplankton are really important for the food web, but also for global climate regulation. As you mentioned already, they take up massive amounts of CO2, and CO2 as a greenhouse gas changes the global climate. So with high CO2, you have a essentially higher greenhouse gas level, which keeps the sun energy within the lower atmosphere, essentially the heat. And phytoplankton takes up that CO2 and reduces this greenhouse gas. And over glacial, interglacial timescales, or even longer than that, phytoplankton has really buffered the climate on Earth. So not only is phytoplankton very important for the food web, it is important for global climate regulation, but it also causes these days a lot of environmental issues. And we can kind of think about walking our dogs along ponds, and we see scums of greenish, brownish stuff there. These are freshwater phytoplankton, Lyngbia or Lyngbia-like algae. They occur filamentous, so they are not occurring as single cells. They are essentially bound together as a filament. And those essentially built these, they built these scums on the surface, smell really bad, and that's an environmental issues. Other similar organisms, like red-tide organisms, Carenia brevis, which I study, which I mentioned earlier, or a cyanobacterium called Trichodesmium, they also occur in these surface blooms in the ocean. Some of them are environmental hazards, like Carenia brevis, when they produce toxins. Others can actually fuel the ocean with nutrients, with nitrogen. So Trichodesmium fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere and releases it into the ocean, allowing other phytoplankton species to actually grow on that. So that is actually something really interesting in terms of their role in an ecosystem. Some are toxic, some are beneficial. Over glacial times, they regulated climate, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that sort of helping us dive into just generally how phytoplankton contribute to the idea of what we think of as a healthy ocean or as a healthy ecosystem and biome for other organisms to survive and to thrive as well. And even you mentioned this idea of how humans sort of perceive phytoplankton, how they come into contact with it, sometimes on lakes, sometimes walking their dogs, or doing recreational activities, might sort of encounter phytoplankton but not think too much about them. And one very prominent way in which phytoplankton are presented is through the dead zone that forms in the Gulf of Mexico from year to year. So we know that in the 19th century, there were dead zones that formed, but throughout the recent 5 decades, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico has become a nearly yearly visitor, and it will reach more than 5,800 square miles this summer, according to predictions from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. And they track the nitrate and phosphorus levels that are discharged from rivers that feed into this specific region of the Gulf of Mexico, which include the Mississippi rivers and some others. So trends in meat consumption in particular have contributed to the severity of agricultural runoff. But in general, we know that nutrient infusion into the ocean with things like nitrate and phosphorus contribute greatly to this formation and why it continues to happen year after year. Could you describe the process by which this nutrient flow happens and how this leads to oxygen depletion and then the creation of dead zones?
Yeah, absolutely. But before I dive into this, if you think about the ocean, the natural ocean, it's essentially a balanced and very fragile system. So phytoplankton takes up nutrients, they get eaten by zooplankton, they get eaten by fish, there's some regeneration of nutrients, and it's always in a well-balanced way. When humans essentially release or dump excess nutrients into the ocean, then this balance breaks down. And suddenly the phytoplankton, which require all these nutrients to grow, can grow faster than they're getting eaten, because sort of the time scales of phytoplankton and zooplankton are different. Phytoplankton grows very fast, responds very fast, and sort of dies within a week or two. While zooplankton, they might realize that there's more food, but it takes them 2, 3, 4 weeks to respond to this enhanced growth. So the phytoplankton can easily sort of overtake an ecosystem. And the way a dead zone is established is not directly through phytoplankton growth, it's very indirect. Actually, it's sort of, if you think about phytoplankton growth and photosynthesis, that produces oxygen. So the phytoplankton itself produce oxygen. So the surface ocean is where the light is oversaturated in oxygen. However, those organisms sink down, then there's no light anymore, then they die. And what happens then is that the microbial ecosystem, all the bacteria, suddenly have a lot of organic matter they can chew on. Those bacteria, they are heterotrophic organisms, meaning they use organic carbon and oxygen to essentially digest the phytoplankton. So with the high respiration rate, they decrease the oxygen in the water column. And there are dead zones all over the world, not just within the Mississippi outflow plume. They occur everywhere, essentially all around our coasts, but also in open ocean regions where there are natural nutrient influxes through upwelling. In the open ocean, it is less problematic for an ecosystem because phytoplankton sinks down very deep. Those dead zones are, let's say, 300 to 600 meter deep or low oxygen zones. And underneath, you have oxygen again through a lot of currents and water mixing. So there's a small proportion of the water column which has lower oxygen. In the Gulf of Mexico, the oxygen depleted zones, they are much more shallow. They are 20 to 60 feet deep or so. And they go down all the way. So all those organisms living on the benthos on the bottom, they suddenly don't have any oxygen anymore and will die. That's why it's called a dead zone. So oxygen, obviously extremely important for all organisms which breathe air or which respire oxygen. And so those organisms will not be able to survive in those regions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that. And it's very interesting, this term you mentioned, upwelling, and this idea of nutrient infusion from below and from deep cold currents. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between that sort of process and this almost artificial or unbalanced process that is happening that leads to the creation of this dead zone, which over time also, ends up fading away, but does end up returning as summers progress?
Yeah, absolutely. So a natural upwelling occurs usually when wind goes in one direction, which then leads to the water on the coast pushing sort of 90-degree offshore. And when water pushes away from the shore, the water has to come from somewhere, and it usually comes from below. And water from below in the ocean interior actually are rich in nutrients. Why? Well, because bacteria already respired a lot of the carbon, but also the nitrogen. So all the nitrates and the phosphates, they, as well as other micronutrients, they come up with these deep water masses and build high productivity ocean zones. Those are natural occurring processes, and the environment has adapted to that. So as I mentioned earlier, when you have river input, even seasonal river input, the zooplankton might not have adjusted to these very fast timescales. But if you have a continuous upwelling, then the ecosystem is well balanced within this area of natural upwelling. And we don't see those large dead zones anymore because the whole food web is essentially adjusted to this. You might get enhanced bacterial respiration, but a lot of grazing is going on, and a lot of energy really goes into the higher food webs up to the fish, the sardines, and anchovies and whatnot you have in the California current, for example. In the Gulf of Mexico, with a river influx, you essentially just have the phytoplankton and then the bacteria. There are certainly grazers who eat the phytoplankton and fuel the food web, but a lot of the organic matter really goes down and is respired by the bacteria.
Yeah, and I think this touches on not only the biological and um, sort of physical impacts that we can see of this dead zone. We can see it from satellite imaging through other methods of imaging, so it's very prominent, and we can sort of see that. But there are also other costs that are associated with the formation of these dead zones, not only, like you mentioned, in the Gulf of Mexico, but on coastal communities and other regions across the world, in fact. For example, over $80 million annually is cost to the seafood and tourism industries in places like Louisiana and Texas, state that we're in currently, and other Gulf Coast states. And in fact, work in the Gulf produces 40% of all seafood in the United States. So this makes finding solutions to this formation, or to mitigate this issue around the world at least, all the more vital. And there is an agency called the Mississippi River and Gulf of Mexico Hypoxia Task Force, very long name, and they've set a long-term goal of reducing the dead zone to 1,900 square miles by 2035. I wanted to ask, do you think there are any long-term solutions or even short-term solutions that are promising, that are being pursued, or should be used to address this issue in the Gulf and beyond?
Absolutely. So there have to be solutions found. And while I'm not an agricultural researcher, I do teach environmental science aspects and global change biology. And just doing research on all of that, we have to, first of all, educate people. We also have to have states working together, because someone in the northern states, any farmer doesn't care what's going on really personally, what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico. They are not personally affected by that. So we need states or federal regulations which work together and try to address this problem. We need to educate farmers to potentially use different farming techniques, change the timing of fertilizing the fields to not be in the rainy season where all the fertilizers get washed away. We can use cover crops or ribarian buffer systems. We can use slow releasing fertilizers. There are many ways we can change the agricultural system. We have to, for the livestock, we probably have to find better waste management. That a lot of that part of the nutrient aspect will not get washed into the system. Obviously, there are now federal funded industrial water treatment plants being established around the Mississippi, which already have reduced the load of nutrients coming down. I have been situated prior to being at Rice in Florida, which have similar issues, and they do have certain water treatment areas where they actually use natural fields and guide the water through from smaller channels through those fields, and those fields take up excess nitrate and phosphorus, and then they release the reduced nutrient water into essentially the canals again, which then go into the ocean. And that definitely helps. If you think about how rivers look naturally as well as coasts look naturally, we had slow flowing rivers, vast areas of wetlands. All of these wetlands and the slower flow helped in previous times the uptake of excess nutrients and thus reduced influx into the Gulf of Mexico. So reestablishing our wetlands, reestablishing certain flooding areas along rivers so that they can take up extra nutrients could definitely be part of a long-term solution. But again, I'm not an agricultural expert or an environmental engineer like you are. I leave this to other people to figure out how it works. But we do have to reduce, obviously, the amount of nutrient flux into the Gulf of Mexico. And there are many ways it is currently being done. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone is shrinking this year, I heard from NOAA, which is great. And this is partially due to reduction in the nutrient flux and uptake through larger treatments. So it is going into the right direction. I'm really positive that we will get to a point, maybe not in the time frame planned, but we will get to a point to actually achieve the goals.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah,
Yep.
thank you for having me on. It was a real pleasure.
Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking with Boyce Upholt about his new book, The Great River, A New History of the Mississippi River. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Caroline Pollan, Alex Little, and Jessica Shue. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.